Thank you, Ann. If you have your Bibles with you, if you'll turn to the Gospel of John, the 5th chapter. The story is verses 1 through 18, but I'm going to be reading for you verses 2 through 9. Maybe this afternoon you can sit down and read the rest of the story. Beginning in the second verse. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, which it has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." And Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well. He took up his mat and began to walk. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Do you wish to be made well? You know, it seems like a harsh question to me to ask somebody who's been obviously sitting beside the pool of Bethesda for several years, waiting for that opportunity to just get into the water, right, and to be first after it had been stirred. Do you wish to be made well? You know, my first response to that question is, who wouldn't want to be well? But if we dig deeper into the story, we may see that there's more to it than what we hear on the surface. Kay Arthur asked that same question as her mind raised to the man that she saw sitting by the gates that surround the old city of Jerusalem. She said, recently as I was on a trip to the old city, we walked out from the old city into the sort of the new area, she said, and there it was, all the buses that were jam-packed with all the tourists and cabs running up and down honking the horns and the bright sunlight that was all there that had been covered up by the walled, crowded, and narrow streets of the old city. She said, as I walked out, I saw a man sitting on the ground and he caught my attention. He was in happy conversation, smiling and cutting up with his friends until we tourists came walking out the gate. And then suddenly, his whole demeanor changed. He went silent and put his hand up and looked you in the eyes as if silently begging for alms. And she said, and what was even more amazing, with one quick gesture, as one hand went up, the other hand pulled up his pants leg to reveal the ulcer that was on the side of his leg. Raw and open, covered in a white mesh. She said it just caught the sun just made it glisten, and it stood out to everyone there. She said, when I saw it, my nurse's heart just basically brought me to a standstill. She said, I wanted to bend down beside him and to shield the wound from all the dust flying around from the traffic and the scurry and the busyness outside the gate. She said, I knew that it should be washed, medicated, and dressed by someone who cared. Why? Because unattended, she knew that it would only eat away until it reached the bone, and then he could actually lose his leg. She was so caught up in that moment, she said, I just stopped there in that moment, and I looked into the darkness of his eyes until finally she felt the nudge of her friend behind her that grabbed her by the elbow and said, come on, we need to move forward. She said, I didn't know what was going on until my friend informed me. She proceeded to tell me that this man did not want to be well. As a matter of fact, he made his living from his wound. No need to confront all the complexities of the people of Israel. But one could just sit down in the dirt and the dust of the city and receive pity and a few shekels. She said, you know what's bad about it is my wounded beggar could have been healed. All it would take is a hospital. The doors of the hospital were open to him. Medicine was available, but he did not wish to be well. She says, as I look back in curious fascination, I caught one glass glimpse of someone less than he could have been. Now return with me to that pool of Bethsaida. We find this man who has been there for years, we don't know how long, waiting, praying, for someone to come along and help him. John doesn't tell us how long he's been there. He just says that he's been in need of healing for 38 years. Why the pool of Bethsaida? You know, this pool is 360 feet long. It's 130 feet wide, and it's 75 feet deep. The colonnade has 5 porches that are around it. It's a monument of wealth and prosperity, but its residents are the diseased, the outcast, the sick. You know, the truth is, underwater there's a spring that causes the water to bubble up. It happens every so often. But the people that gather didn't believe it was a spring. They believed it was actually an angel of the Lord that would come down and touch his wings to the water. And when his wings touched the water and the water was stirred, as that angel went back up to heaven, there was healing. So the first person to step in the water would be made well. Did healing actually occur? To be honest, I don't know. All I know is that people who came from all over the country believed, hoped that healing could happen. Now you may be saying, what a superstition. But you know what? It's that kind of superstition, that belief that has spread all over the world in ancient days. And realistically, it still exists in many places today. The people who gathered, like so many others, are children of their age. But you know, as I thought about it, is it any different than our age? How many people will travel unbelievable distances to go to a research hospital and to go and be treated with an experimental drug that may or may not heal them of their battle of cancer? How many of us have ordered vitamins or one of those miracle pills that you see on the infomercials? Those pills that help you regain your youthful appearance? Those pills that stop the process of aging, that cause your hair to grow, or that cause miraculous weight loss. Don't change your diet. Don't do anything. Just sit down and you'll lose weight. See, they, like so many of us sitting in this room, are searching for hope in the middle of a hopeless situation. So, it just seems natural to me that Jesus would show up. I mean, that's his ministry. Jesus' ministry is centered on bringing hope to the hopeless, peace to the struggling, wholeness to the broken. Why he stopped and picked this particular man, we're not told. Maybe it was just somebody pointed to him and told Jesus the story. This guy's been here all these years. He's paralyzed. There's no way. It's impossible for him to beat everybody else into the water. We don't know what happened, but it's in that moment that Jesus comes to this man who is caught in an impossible task. And Jesus walks over to him, looks him in the eyes and asks that question: do you wish to be made well? Jesus really calling him to make a choice. He could continue in the normal habit of life, or he can let go and be healed. Jesus is asking us the same question today. Do you wish to be made well? Now, I don't know about you. When I first read it this week, my immediate response was, Lord, I am well. And this week when I said that on Monday morning in my office, I could not help but feel the eyes of Jesus upon me and continued to hear those penetrating words that kept ringing in my ears all day long. Do you wish to be made well? I broke out one of the commentaries, Barclay's commentary, and began to read. And he wrote these words that really got my attention. Jesus' real question is, do you want to be changed? In our innermost hearts, or if we are content to stay where we are, then there can be no change for us. It was in that moment that question began to come out differently. Instead of hearing, do you want to be made well, I all of a sudden heard, do you want to be changed? Do you want to be whole? Are you ready to give up old habits that pull you away from health, from wholeness, from a closer relationship with me, and take a step towards the true life? See, I'll admit I'm a lot like that man in John 5, and I only came up with excuses. Lord, I do want to be made well. I do want to change. But, Lord, you know how busy I am. My life's pretty busy. I've got a job. I've got a spouse. I got a house. I got 2 kids. I got all kinds of responsibilities. Lord, there's barely enough time in the day to get everything done that has to be done. And then you think I should spend time with you? Come on, Lord. It's hard to connect with others, to pray, to study my Bible. Lord, there's only so many hours in the day. You're the one that only gave us 24. If you want it all done, why didn't you give us 25 or 26? Yes, Lord, I want to be well, but... See, just like the lame man, I came up with excuses. And just like Jesus did, he didn't listen to me either. And he asked that question again, do you want to be made well? Do you want to change? Michael Card, in his book, The Parable of Joy, says this of the man. Says that he clings to his disability like a lifesaver because it saves him from life itself. So I wonder if that statement pertains to us. Do we use our disabilities, our busyness, our lack of time, our jobs, our children, our activities, our parents, or our really important stuff, our hobbies, as a lifesaver to save us from life itself? Or better yet, not just to save us from life, but to save us from the abundant life that God has in store for us. See, I wonder if, like the man in the story, that we are afraid to look inside ourselves and to truly wrestle with those questions. Do you want to be made well? Do you want to change? This man had to decide. If he was going to get back in the game of life, he had to look inside and to deal with his illness before he could be made well. Because for 38 years, he is laid on the sidelines as life has passed him by. He has waited for someone to help. He had hoped that someone would come along and not just give him alms and money, but someone would come along and put him in the pool before anyone else. He had hoped that healing would come, but wholeness, healing would mean, you know what? He would have to move off the sidelines and get back into the game. It meant he'd have to go out and get a job. It meant he couldn't count on someone else to take care of him. He would have to take care of himself. But isn't it the same way for us? If we truly want to be made well, then we must be willing to look inside ourselves and honestly ask, if we want to change. It's a scary thing. Because anytime you take an honest look inside yourself, anytime you step back and look at your life, you begin to realize the truth about who you are. You begin to see where your priorities are placed and if they are in proper order. You begin to question your devotion and you begin to see your illness. See, the things that are holding us back, those are the things that Jesus is challenging us and that man. Our excuses, our shortcomings, our failures, to turn away from them and turn towards him. William Quall, who was a Methodist bishop in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was riding on a train one day and was sitting beside a group of men, and they were having several businessmen. They were having just a discussion, and these businessmen didn't have a clue who this guy was. And finally, one of them looked at him and said, "Well, mister, what line of business are you in? What do you deal in?" The bishop looked over at them, and with a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his lips, he said, "I am in the business of horizons." See, my boss, his name is Jesus, and he dealt with horizons. He dealt with lifting people's eyes from what they are to what they might become. See, I think that's what John is wanting us to hear in this story, to quit making excuses. Healing, wholeness, change is impossible alone. But the power that we need to do those things is standing right here before us. All we've got to do is turn our eyes towards him. Of course, that means we would also have to bend our will to his will. And then the impossible becomes possible. Read a story about a professor, Herbert Jackson, who was teaching a missionary class. During the class, he was telling the students about when he served as a missionary. He said, the first 2 years out of seminary, I was on mission. And he said, when I got to the mission place, he said, I was given a car. He said, the only problem was the car wouldn't start. Now, he said, thank goodness it was a straight shift, so I was able to figure it out. And he said, what I did is I went to the little local school across the street and talked to the teacher into letting her class come out for a few minutes. And I got in the car and put it out of gear, and the kids started pushing. And when we got up enough momentum, I popped the clutch, and that cranked the car, and off I went. He said, the rest of that day, I never cut the car off unless I could find a good hill to park on, and then I could run downhill and get it started. He says, as a matter of fact, for the whole 2 years I was there, the only way I got around was to jump start that car and jump it off a hill and go down the hill. He said, so after 2 years, there was illness in my family. I had to come home from the mission field. When the new missionary arrived, I walked him out to show him the car, and I immediately began to tell him the story, how wonderful I was, and this ingenious plan I had come up with of how to keep the car going or how to start it every time I needed. He said, while I was talking, this young whippersnapper walked around and opened the hood of the car, started looking. He said, then I heard him mumbling for a few minutes, and he walked back, sat in the driver's seat, turned the key, boom, the engine fired up. He said, oh, Dr. Jackson, don't worry about it. There was just a loose wire, and I tightened it up a little bit, and now it runs like a top. I tell you that story because John wants us to know that we have the power to overcome our impossibilities, and it is standing right before us if we are willing to look up, to look into his eyes, to look towards the horizon, and allow that connection to work through us. Listen to the J.B. Phillips paraphrase of Ephesians 1, 19 and 20. How tremendous is the power available to us who believe in God. When we turn our eyes towards Jesus, we are reconnecting to his life and power flowing through us. And God has given us the power to change. All we have to do is connect. Well, that's not it. That's not all. And then we have to move in faith. You know, I want you to go back to the story. What did Jesus tell him? Remember? He asked him the question. Jesus listened to his excuses, and then Jesus never missed a beat. He looked the man in his eyes and he said, stand up, take your mat, and walk. You've got to hear it. Faith is not passive. Faith is active. Jesus is calling us to change. He has given us the power that we need, and now we have to act. Dr. J.B. Gambrell actually tells us an amusing story about General Stonewall Wallace in his famous Valley Campaign. Jackson's army found itself on the wrong side of the river, literally. I mean, they did. They were on one side of the river, and they needed to be on the other side of the river. So General Jackson called all of his engineers together, and he said, listen, I need you to make plan and build a bridge so that I can move the army from this side to that side. After he had finished with them and they had left, he called his wagon masters in to tell them that they were in urgent need of getting the wagons across the river as soon as possible. Well, the wagon masters started gathering all the logs, all the rocks, all the fence rails they could find, and they built a bridge. Long before daylight, General Jackson was told by one of his underlings that all of the wagons and all of the artillery had already crossed the river. General Jackson looked and said, well, where are the engineers? What are they doing? The only reply he got was, well, they're still in their tent, drawing up the plans to build a bridge. So many times we spend more time drawing up the plans than we do acting on God's call in our life. Faith is action. When Moses lifted the staff at the Red Sea, we think it just parted. But most of it, when you dig and read, you'll hear Moses not only lifted the staff, but Moses lifted his feet and began to walk towards the water. And it was not until he touched the water that the water began to part. When Joshua led the people of God across the Jordan River, Joshua sent the priest and the Ark of the Covenant, and he told them to go out into the water. And when they walked out into the water, the flow of the water stopped so that the people could walk across the land on dry ground. When Gideon is called out of his hole to lead God's people against the Midianites, Gideon has got 30,000 soldiers that show up. And God cuts it to 300. And yet Gideon and his soldiers still went and did battle, and God gave them victory. When David walked out to meet Goliath, yes, he had a slingshot in his hand, but God was the one that guided that slingshot because David slung it. Matthew got up from his tax collector's booth and he followed Jesus because why? He left what was ahead. Peter, there's only two men ever walked on water, and I don't care what any of you say, there's only two, and Jesus is one and Peter's the other. Peter's in the middle of a storm, and Jesus calls him out to him, and Peter jumps over the side of the boat while the other disciples are begging him to stay in, and he walks. I know it was just a couple of steps, but you try it sometime. Faith is what moved that ragtag bunch of disciples out of a fear-filled upper room, and sent them to Jerusalem, to to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, so much that they were actually turning the world upside down. Faith is not faith unless we act upon that faith. So that's what it's about. It's believing so much in God. It's believing that God is true to His word and that God can and will work miracles within us. And God, through Jesus, can truly change our lives so that we may be whole. Do you want to be changed? Do you want to be changed? Stand up, take your mat, and walk. Amen. There's Ron.